Under the midday sun, the generator inside the event center sputtered, coughed, and died. A chilling silence fell across the venue as screens went dark. Indicators flashed a critical red. CEO Victoria Thorne, rigid with panic, stormed into the engine bay with her management team. Frantic engineers erupted into an argument over the multi-million-dollar fix. Elias, a single dad in worn overalls, calmly watched the chaos unfold. Victoria laughed at the disaster. "Fix the generator now," a senior manager whispered coldly. "He's maintenance, ignore him." Elias stepped directly forward. "I'll fix it, if you give me one single thing." The entire room went dead silent. Elias was a necessary ghost in the gleaming, temporary world of Thorne Media's corporate event. He was a contract field mechanic, an essential worker existing on the lowest tier of the organizational chart, only acknowledged when a wrench was critically required. His uniform was simple, bearing the honest stains of real work. He held no corporate power, just competence on the ground, the messy, often thankless reality of keeping complex machinery alive. His life was dictated by his daughter Maya, who required constant, highly specialized medical care. Her complex autoimmune disorder demanded not just medical intervention, but absolute consistency in environment and scheduling, something that corporate chaos could never guarantee. He desperately needed a stable income, flexible hours for hospital visits, and consistent gold-tier health insurance. The field mechanic work, while professionally anonymous, offered the benefits and schedule predictability he prioritized. Crucially, it allowed him to be the one who handled the inevitable crises on his own terms, rather than being the target of them, forced to work erratic hours. 10 years ago, he was known as Ethan Reed, a celebrated chief engineer in advanced energy solutions. He sat in glass-walled boardrooms and was a recognized name globally. He possessed the ambition and immense visibility that CEO Victoria Thorne now commanded. He'd personally overseen the commissioning of power systems for Olympic venues and international summits, earning a reputation for audacious, yet flawlessly stable designs. But when Maya's life-altering diagnosis arrived, the high-stakes, erratic world of corporate innovation, where deadlines were gods and human costs were externalities, became a direct threat to her well-being. He consciously walked away from the spotlights, trading the pursuit of engineering brilliance for the absolute guarantee of familial stability. He chose a life where he could expertly fix an alternator by 2 p.m. and be reliably home in time for a bedtime story. A life free from the sudden international travel and the 3 a.m. emergency calls that defined his old prestige. A life dedicated to quiet, fundamental excellence. Now he was simply Elias. The stage where Victoria Thorne's flagship media event was currently failing was powered by 3 massive, synchronized generators. Elias's contract only stipulated his responsibility for the secondary unit. His presence today was purely accidental, covering a shift near the primary hub. Victoria Thorne, the ruthless CEO of Thorne Media, saw the world exclusively in terms of competitive speed and transactional leverage. She measured human value purely by the size of the P&L statement they controlled. To her, Elias was an overhead cost, a necessary, interchangeable commodity, a cog in the machine that was supposed to simply work without question. Her reputation was built on delivering flawless, high-profile, live events. The immense pressure of the live broadcasts, scheduled to begin in less than 2 agonizing hours, was her natural, demanding environment. This current event was a strategic, multi-million-dollar contract. For Victoria, literal failure was simply not an option. When the massive primary generator died, Victoria's composed facade completely shattered. The disaster was instantaneous, public, and financially crippling. Her internal technical team had tried every standard diagnostic checklist. All failed. They were professionally paralyzed, arguing fiercely over the next dangerous step. Elias observed the spiraling chaos. The frantic, checklist-driven arguments were obviously futile. He could clearly see the deep panic, the utter reliance on digital readouts that were now blank. He instinctively knew the machine demanded far more than a simple procedure. He always wore a heavy, perfectly calibrated mechanical watch, a subtle connection to his engineering past. He was trained to measure precise tolerance and electrical tempo using his ear and his hand, not just a tool. This instinct told him the frantic efforts of the main team were fundamentally wrong. When Victoria made her desperate public offer, "Fix it, ask for anything," she was utilizing the only language she truly understood: transactional power. She was attempting to throw massive wealth at a technical problem, but Elias, who had willingly rejected fame and wealth for a higher intrinsic value, knew that her anything was worthless to him. He knew the ambient chaos was the single thing preventing him from seeing the problem clearly. He desperately needed the profound silence to work. His request for absolute silence was the opening, non-negotiable salvo in a fight for true competence. He wasn't asking for money or promotion. He was demanding the one environment where true engineering could occur, forcing the high-stakes executives to bend to the rules of the machine, not their panic. The chief contractor, Miller, was drenched in sweat. The heat inside the generator bay, already amplified by the sun and residual thermal energy, felt like a physical assault, clinging to their frantic movements. He viewed Elias's calm request as an insult. "Impossible," Miller sneered into his radio. "We've confirmed an unrepeatable fault code. The load fluctuation is absolutely abnormal. Wild, sudden swings before the internal safety system trips. It's either a fried main control board or a catastrophic short. That's a 30-minute replacement cluster. Minimum. We've isolated the frequency range. We ran a full digital spectrum analysis 5 times. The software says this is a physical component failure, Elias. It's a job for the replacement team, not manual override." Victoria's sharp voice cracked over the tense radio waves. 30 minutes is entirely unacceptable, Miller. If we miss the broadcast window, we don't just lose this contract. We lose next season's contracts too. The financial damage will be irreparable. I want that cluster replaced now. We risk losing the entire crucial broadcast window. She instructed them to prioritize reckless speed over essential safety. Her face, visible on the periphery, was a mask of cold financial terror, every syllable aimed at generating pressure, not solutions. The air crackled with her anxiety. Elias deliberately ignored the escalating chatter, moving closer to the massive, silent generator. He pressed his calloused palm directly against the casing, feeling the residual, uneven heat concentrated heavily near the secondary grounding point. The heat wasn't uniform. It pulsed, indicating an uneven resistance load, a signature missed by the infrared scanners. He utterly disregarded the useless diagnostic lights, trusting his instincts. He detected a faint, acrid scent, the chemical whiff of critically overheated capacitor fluid. This physical evidence immediately contradicted the technical team's frantic digital diagnosis. Miller's team was relying on digital proxies and protocols. Elias was reading the physical language of the machine, trusting the subtle warnings that documentation often missed. The network feed, showing a painful split view of the struggling operation, was a severe blow to Victoria's brand credibility. Miller was now visibly shaking, screaming into his headset, "I need a full systems check. We have to switch the load. Forget the 7 minutes, we need the 30 minutes to do this safely. If we rush the replacement, we risk a cascading power failure across the entire secondary grid, potentially damaging millions in equipment." Elias calmly pushed past Miller. "Your filters are useless against this frequency," Elias insisted, his eyes locked on the panel. "Your proposed solution is to change the heart when the underlying problem is in the blood. When you attempt to replace that cluster, the sudden manual load transfer will introduce more noise. You will cause a full system trip and immediately fuse the new board. We will lose the entire day." He spoke not in the panicked tones of the crisis, but with the cool precision of a man stating an irrefutable law of physics. His calmness was an anchor in the eye of their storm. Victoria was now watching Elias exclusively. The rising panic in Miller's eyes was contrasted entirely by the unshakable stillness and control of the field mechanic. Elias realized the generator wasn't failing to produce power. It was failing to reject bad electrical energy. He mentally reconstructed the system's history: non-repeating fault, abnormal load swings, continuous safety trips. He identified the insidious culprit, a sudden, powerful spike in odd harmonic interference, most likely caused by aging internal components and the heavy, nonlinear loads of the video walls. This interference was not a hardware failure, but an invisible electrical disease, causing the internal protective systems to panic and shut down the system. If Victoria forced the expensive replacement, they would be installing pristine hardware into a system already infected with profound electrical noise, likely destroying the new board instantly. The expensive, modern solution would guarantee total failure, proving that relying purely on hardware replacement was a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. Elias stood up, moving directly between Miller and Victoria. "You cannot replace the cluster," he stated, his voice calm, clear. "The fundamental failure is not in the hardware, it is in the signature. There is an odd harmonic load collapse. It's tripping your safety at random, non-repeating intervals. Replacing components will merely destroy them." Miller scoffed instantly. "You're a field hand, Elias. You think we haven't checked for noise? We have filtered lines. We follow the book, and the book says this is a Type A component failure. Your instinct is irrelevant. Our equipment is rated for this kind of noise suppression. Your filters are only working on standard expected frequencies," Elias countered. "The grounding point is drifting. It's allowing the third and fifth harmonics to violently resonate back through the bus bar. That's why your fault codes are non-repeating. They're fighting the resonant frequency. I need to isolate the non-critical video feed branch, the biggest contributor to the noise, for 5 minutes. I can manually damp the ground return and rebalance the phase load." This specific request was a procedural nightmare. Isolating a critical branch without the standard digital lockout was strictly outside procedure. It required a forbidden old-school manual bypass. Victoria, seeing the lead contractor hesitate in the broadcast countdown timer, now agonizingly close to 30 minutes, felt the media pressure mounting. The CEO had to decide between the safety-first, 30-minute corporate protocol, which guaranteed missing the broadcast, and the risky, instinct-driven 7-minute manual fix, which offered a chance at salvation. 5 minutes to isolate? Victoria challenged. "If you make things worse, I'll hold you personally liable. Your contract will be void." He simply held up his hand, his eyes demanding respect. 5 minutes of isolation to diagnose and recalibrate. 7 minutes total for the fix. I guarantee the system stabilizes, but I need the silence I asked for. No more radio chatter, no whispering, not one word. The risk was immense, but the calm assurance in Elias's voice was too compelling to dismiss entirely. Victoria stared intently at Elias. Miller was promising 30 minutes. Elias was promising guaranteed success in 7. She made her calculated decision. 7 minutes. Elias, you have the 7 minutes you asked for. Miller, stand down. Everyone, silence. Now. Elias completely ignored the transactional authorization. "I still require absolute silence," he repeated, looking pointedly at the entire management cluster. "I work by feel. You will not speak." A wave of stunned, profound silence spread instantly. Elias knelt, his focus absolute. Twist 1, the revelation. Elias moved to the small tertiary grounding inspection plate, a spot routinely ignored. He removed the cover, reached inside, and pressed his fingers against the copper bus bar, holding his ear impossibly close to the casing. He was listening deeply to the machine's barely audible pulse. He was listening for a specific resonant hum, the exact harmonic vibration. He had no need for a digital readout. He was trained to measure precise tolerance, subtle vibration, and electrical tempo using his ear and his hand, not just a tool. Every thought was a high-speed engineering calculation. He clearly remembered the original design review meeting, a decade prior, where he had vehemently fought for this specific custom grounding plate. He recalled the boardroom fight with the financial team, who had argued the custom plate was an unnecessary expense. Ethan Reed had stood his ground, insisting that the plate's micro-adjustability was the only way to safeguard against long-term thermal drift in high-load environments. The younger Ethan had won the design battle, and now the older Elias had to clean up the inevitable decay of his own creation. The irony tasted profoundly bitter. The superior design choice he had made as a brilliant young engineer named Ethan Reed was now the Achilles heel he, the anonymous field mechanic named Elias, had to manually correct. He didn't just know the machine's operating parameters. He knew its profound soul. Victoria, standing close enough to hear the faint metallic rasp of the hex key, fumbled desperately for her phone, pulling up an old archived article detailing the next-gen power solution. The headline flashed, "Ethan Reed, the architect of clean power," next to his photo, confirming his identity. The accompanying photo was of a man younger, clean-shaven, and wearing a crisp white shirt, but the eyes were unmistakably the same. Ethan Reed. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She felt the blood instantly drain from her face. Ethan Reed wasn't just a former chief engineer. He was an industry legend who had walked away from a multi-billion-dollar startup to vanish completely. This man, who had once dictated terms to entire energy consortiums, was cleaning her coolant filters, doing the work she considered beneath her. She had publicly mocked a former corporate leader of his undisputed caliber, reducing him to a low-level worker, right before he fixed a crisis he himself had conceptually designed a decade earlier. She had been staring directly at pure, untapped genius and treating it like disposable labor. The shame was a sudden physical weight. She realized her laughter had been directed not at a mechanic, but at her own willful ignorance and flawed corporate vision. He realized the problem was elegantly simple, yet impossible to find with any standard digital tools. The external temperature fluctuations and load cycling had caused the copper grounding point to physically drift, a minute, microscopic movement outside the original design specification. This minute displacement created the specific harmonic feedback loop, causing the system to constantly self-destruct. The fault was not in the big expensive hardware, it was in the calibration of a tiny, critical part. Elias presented his findings concisely. The generator is perfectly sound. The load balance is critically misaligned due to grounding drift. The safety system is working too well, trying to protect itself. I will rebalance the phase, correct the drift, and the system will accept the load again. Victoria, who now recognized the name, stared at him in horrified silence. She saw not a field mechanic, but a highly skilled engineer who had intentionally downgraded his career. The shock of the realization that the man she had publicly demeaned possessed a vastly superior level of expertise than everyone currently on her massive payroll combined was visceral. His hands, though calloused from years of physical work, moved with an intelligence she had previously only seen in boardrooms negotiating billion-dollar deals. He was proof that the highest competence often existed outside the corner office. 7 minutes, she repeated, her voice now barely a strained whisper. Go! Elias worked with the blinding speed and surgical confidence of a master watchmaker. He executed the manual shunt to isolate the non-critical branch. He then used the specialized hex key to microscopically adjust the grounding point, listening intently to the changing harmonic hum. His focus was absolute. At 6 minutes and 48 seconds, the low harmonic hum vanished entirely, replaced by the deep, consistent purr of perfect electrical equilibrium. He calmly closed the inspection plate. When he signaled for the power to be instantly restored, the video walls burst back into vivid life. The sound system clicked on, smooth and clean. The entire system immediately stabilized, the digital readouts flashing solid green, accepting the massive load without a single hiccup. The whole complex froze. The applause did not begin immediately. There was an agonizing, profound, prolonged silence as everyone processed the instantaneous, impossible fix the single dad had delivered. The silence stretched again, heavier than any noise. Victoria closed her hand tightly around her phone, the archived article on Ethan Reed now confirming her worst fears. Twist 2. The emotional counter-strike. Victoria walked toward him. She had to honor her debt. Elias, she said, her voice softer than anyone present had ever heard it. You fixed it. My promise stands. Anything. What do you want? Name your price. Name your position. The VP role is yours. I will triple your offer, whatever it takes to get you on my side. She offered him unimaginable wealth and unparalleled status. Elias stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his worn overalls, and looked directly into her eyes, ignoring the frantic clicking cameras. "I want two things," he said, his voice measured, completely devoid of emotion. "First, I want to keep my contract exactly as it is. Second," he paused, the silence in the room becoming absolutely unbearable, forcing every executive to hold their breath. "That's why you don't fix panic with pressure," he added, his voice a low, profound statement. "The system is fixed. The lesson is free. That lesson is the only payment I will accept from Thorn Media." The line cut through the expectant atmosphere like a knife. He hadn't asked for money. He had demanded institutional integrity. The power had instantly and completely transferred from Victoria's promise of wealth to Elias's undeniable technical and moral authority. The silence was his payment. He had traded a momentary fortune for permanent moral leverage. The media instantly recognized the immense magnitude of the moment. "We are live back at the Thorn Media event," the anchor's voice boomed, "and we have just witnessed an absolute miracle. The entire production was saved not by a high-priced executive, but by a field mechanic, a single father, who delivered the most stunning 7 minutes of engineering most of us have ever seen. His calm, precise work bypassed a multi-million-dollar panic. This is the definition of corporate competence delivered by the unlikeliest hero. And his price? Not money, but a demand for safety and integrity." The remote cameras previously focused on Victoria were now fixed entirely on Elias. Miller, the lead contractor, stood rigid, his face a complex mixture of professional shame and profound awe. His 30-minute replacement plan had been rendered utterly obsolete by a 7-minute manual calibration. He realized Elias hadn't just fixed the machine. He had understood it at a molecular level, bypassing the entire reliance on faulty tech. Miller slowly walked over to his junior engineers, his voice thick with uncharacteristic humility. "We relied on the screen. He relied on the science. We were wrong. Learn the difference. Don't forget what you saw here today." One of Miller's junior engineers approached Elias, her voice trembling slightly with respect. "Mr. Elias, the way you compensated the phase imbalance, that's almost forgotten knowledge. It's the kind of subtle calibration they don't teach in modern electrical engineering programs anymore. The art of listening to the current." Elias merely smiled gently. "The fundamentals always work. Don't let the software blind you to the sound." His calm, decisive demeanor immediately calmed the technical crew, who recognized true leadership in this quiet competence. The event, now running smoothly, continued on the restored power. Victoria immediately issued a clear, firm directive over the internal radio system. "Halt all secondary emergency decisions. All maintenance personnel will strictly return to standard operating procedures. No executive override is permitted without direct physical sign-off from the maintenance lead." The panic ended instantly. The atmosphere around the power hub calmed, the frantic energy replaced by quiet, focused professionalism. Victoria later found Elias checking the coolant levels on the auxiliary generator. She approached him, not as his CEO, but as someone genuinely seeking profound knowledge. "Why?" she asked, hesitant. "Why the grounding point? And why did you give up a chief engineer title to become a field mechanic? That level of expertise, it belongs at the top, directing strategy." Elias patiently explained his life with Maya and the non-negotiable need for guaranteed stability. He spoke about his old job, where he spent 90% of his time managing political egos and only 10% doing real engineering. "I left the light, Madam CEO, because the light was preventing me from being reliably present where I was needed most. My success was built on chasing deadlines, which created inherent risk in the system. I needed to eliminate that risk for my daughter and for myself." He then patiently explained the grounding drift, emphasizing that the core problem wasn't a lack of money, but a critical lack of attention to detail. "Your engineers checked the manual. I listened to the machine. You paid them to react. I get paid to reliably prevent. Reactive leadership is expensive, Miss Thorne. Preventive competence applied quietly is priceless." Victoria realized her entire leadership method, based solely on pressure and transactional rewards, was fundamentally flawed. Her constant, ruthless drive for speed had blindfolded her entire team to the quiet, crucial work of safety and prevention. Her attempts to use the anything promise had revealed her own deep arrogance. She had been leading by fear, which strictly encourages dangerous shortcuts. She recognized that she was paying millions for panic and ignoring the competence that offered silence and stability. The technical team now looked at Elias with profound silent respect. He had proven that their on-the-ground fundamental experience held more genuine value than any executive's rush checklist. The promise of anything had bought Victoria a harsh public lesson in essential leadership, delivered by the quietest man on the entire payroll. The very next day, Victoria Thorne urgently called Elias to her executive office. She tabled a new executive-level contract, a massive seven-figure annual salary, and the immediate creation of a brand new role, VP of Technical Systems Integrity. Elias listened patiently. "Madam CEO," he replied, gently pushing the paperwork back. "My daughter's stability remains my sole priority. I choose the field, not the office. That is the only contract that truly matters to me." He did not want a seat at the table. He wanted the table to be stable. He understood that true power lay in necessity, not title. He accepted none of the offered wealth. Instead, he presented his final, non-negotiable demand. "I will accept the VP title only on one condition. It must be purely functional and grants me full, documented veto authority over all operational decisions related to safety, equipment procurement, and maintenance scheduling. This authority must apply across all departments, regardless of budget or executive pressure. I must be allowed to stop an event cold if I see preventable risk, without having to negotiate or justify myself to the finance committee. No compromise." He was asking for the foundational authority to stop the company from repeating its fundamental mistakes, the power to enforce stability and safety from the bottom of the organization up to the top. This was power that superseded Victoria's own authority in the technical domain. Victoria, now operating from a position of profound, hard-earned respect, instantly recognized the immense wisdom of the proposal. Elias was building an unassailable firewall of quiet competence directly into the core of her organization. She agreed immediately, signing a new corporate policy that fundamentally changed the balance of power within Thorne Media, prioritizing safety and integrity over short-term speed and profit. The policy was quickly dubbed the Reed Protocol, a permanent institutional reminder that expertise, not title, commanded final authority in technical matters. It was a formal surrender of arrogance. The major contract was successfully secured, and the event was hailed as a legendary corporate success, not for the smooth broadcast, but for the story of the quiet engineer who saved it. The narrative was complete, the definitive triumph of quiet skill over corporate arrogance. Elias returned to his job. He was still the single dad in the simple coveralls, still quietly clocking out early for Maya's essential appointments. But he was no longer professionally invisible. When he walked onto any site, every contractor, every executive, and every camera crew knew exactly who he was. They knew he was the only man in the entire company with the unique, absolute power to halt an entire multi-million-dollar production with a single, quiet command. The corporate culture began to subtly shift. Engineers felt empowered to speak up, knowing their expertise was now guarded by the Reed Protocol, and managers learned to listen to the people on the ground. A CEO had fundamentally changed her entire decision-making process. A reckless corporate system had been saved by calm, essential competence. The crisis was completely over, but the value of integrity and quiet work remained, now permanently woven into the company's DNA by the single dad who refused to compromise his core principles for a fancy title. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Single Dad Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.